a very beautiful community. Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin tyrant, did a press conference in Minsk. And one of the questions was asked by Mr. Zarubin, who is a propagandist journalist who travels with Putin and asks Putin planted questions. And Putin struggled to answer the question. He just talked for 10 minutes, somewhat in circles, and he was stressed, he was emotional, and he was frustrated about somehow not being understood, and yet he wasn't addressing anybody. He wasn't addressing the Russian people, he wasn't addressing the journalist, he wasn't addressing a Western audience either, he wasn't addressing any of the people around him, he was talking to himself. My dear friend, the journalist Anita McNaught, who spent a lot of time in places run by tyrants, likes to say that when you reach sort of a 15-year mark in unaccounted, unbounded power, you become loopy. And with Putin, we're talking a quarter of a century. So this was like somebody knocking on your door, and we'll read the thing in my casual translation in a second, and not wanting to stop talking, not wanting to leave, but not wanting to engage in dialogue with you either. You open the door and they say, hi. The thing is that like my towels are getting worn, and I went to the shop yesterday to get new ones, but it was closed, and then the shop next to it didn't have the discount I was hoping it would have, and then I got some towels, and it was the right thing to do because um, I was debating whether the color was right, but it was the right thing to do. And so I got the towels, and a lot of people are just not understanding how I'm setting up my house in terms of all of the arrangements. And I actually have 2 bathrooms, and I place 3 or 4 towels in each. And I think that the towel game of the other people on the street is kind of wrong, but they're not understanding what my towel game is all about. And like, why are you talking to me about this? It's a combination of loneliness, frustration about not being understood, and then some kind of stress around being excluded or deprioritized. That's what that neighbor feels. When they are concocting grievances around their towel purchases and their towel deployment in their bathrooms. And much the same range of emotion is felt in Putin in this talk. And part of this is really about the fact that, on the one hand, he is convinced that Europe will eventually land in a kind of a puddle of incapacity. But he's frustrated that that's not quite happening yet, and that these commitments to 5% defense spending are being talked about, and that's not quite what he wants to hear. So it's sort of like somebody who's playing a computer game, and they've got some kind of token box they're opening, and they know in the end, they're convinced that they're going to get the token they need, but they have to open 20 tokens first, and they're on number 12, and they still haven't got the one they need. They're confident they'll get it by the time they get to 20. Putin is confident of Europe's decline, but he's frustrated. He's at 12 and it's not quite resolved yet. Okay, Tyrant in the Kremlin. Now, what I don't do is I don't read out the Kremlin website translation of it, because it's a little bit more formalized and bureaucratic. This is a crap translation, but it's a sort of an instant type translation that I do as I listen to Putin. It's more real. You get a sense of the person. You get a sense of his emotiveness. You get a sense of his obsession with detail, and his capacity. Well, actually, maybe not in the stuff I'm going to read to you, but generally, he is very strong on detail, Bill Clinton-like almost. And he's very legalistic in the way he speaks. This agreement was made, but it wasn't honored. He might be lying about all of it or deluded about all of it, but he's very, very big on legalistic speak. Even when he takes out his political opponents, he likes to talk about it in legalistic terms. Um, and there's always this background of insufficiency. There's always this background of grievance around deprioritization. There's always this background of, I hate the West because I love the West so much and it's neglected me. So, and that's funnily enough a Putinite disease, but it's also a reflection of a Russian cultural disease, which is a kind of an aversion to the West that takes the form, once you analyze it properly, of an almost complete normative dependence on the West. And that's why people like Mr. Dugin are so humiliating, because he is essentially trying to build an anti-Western vessel to, let him travel down the river out of materials that are entirely, entirely Western. Let's look at what's happening in Western countries, Mr. Putin says. And because of the toxicity of the speech, you have to actually have an oxygen supply when you read Putin's speeches. It's the latest. It's the law now. That's what you've got to do. They're forever trying to bury us, this West, but soon they'll drop dead themselves. But yeah, they can't stop burying us, but they'll drop dead soon. But they talk about burying us all the time. And so there's this frustration that they are about to drop dead soon, but they're not quite dropping dead yet, and that's disappointing. I mean, it's not that disappointing because I think history will work out in the end. Putin is a kind of a Fukuyamian in reverse around the West's decline. But basically, he thinks that it's frustrating that something that's inevitably going to fall his way is not yet falling his way. When it comes to military matters, they go on about our supposed problem, about how they will soon inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. And Putin gets agitated when he mentions strategic defeat, because for him, he can't fully separate that from him losing power. So there's a kind of a Gaddafi-derived trauma for Putin around talk of strategic defeat for Russia. But at the same time, even though they go on about strategic defeat for Russia, they keep broadcasting that Russia will launch an attack on NATO countries. Where is their logic? If everything is falling apart for us, on what basis are we going to attack NATO? They're talking rot. They definitely don't believe it themselves. They're trying to convince their populations of it so as to extract more money from people and convince people to eat up the inevitable deleterious social consequences of the extra military spending. And later on, outside of this answer, Putin comes back in this public appearance and again emphasizes that the extra spending will yield Europe no military gain, but will give a big societal hit to Europe. And we've talked about this recently, this tension in the West about needing to focus more on our defense, but also understanding that that will undermine our capacity to focus on social goods, which we actually need to not, accelerate loss of trust in institutions in our societies. That's a paradox, because if we accelerate loss of trust in institutions, to a degree the military spending will be less pointful, because we will have governments who won't be sufficiently strategic or even sufficiently anti-Russian to put that spending in the right direction. Putin goes on, and no, we're spending our money on our military industrial complex, on ourselves. But they're going to spend their 5% on purchases from the United States. They're going to be propping up not their own, but America's military industrial complex. And it's none of our business. They can do it if they want. But here is the most important thing, Putin says. Unlike them, we are planning to cut defense spending next year and the year after, as well as in the 3 years that follow. The Defense Ministry and the Finance Ministry and the Ministry of Economic Development have yet to reach an agreement on this, but in general, everybody is thinking along these lines. And Europe is thinking about how to raise its defense expenses. So who's getting ready for aggressive action in the future? Is it us or is it them? Now, when Putin speaks, like Trump, although for a different reason. He doesn't lie. And Trump doesn't lie because Trump's a post-truth politician. He, in his own mind, has a problem of untethering of the distinction between truth and lies. That's why often Trump trades on dispositional states rather than actual beliefs. Meanwhile, Putin doesn't really lie, not because he is himself a post-truth politician. He presides over a post-truth regime, but funnily enough, dispositionally, he is not a post-truth politician. He is very clear about the difference between truth and lies. So why then wouldn't we say that Putin just lies all the time? Well, I resist saying that because Putin so transparently relates to speech as political technology that it's unhelpful to think of what he does as lies, even though he is lying indeed, and he is lying with a greater psychological coherence than Trump. But I still don't prefer to, in the first instance, label it as lies, because this is a man who just relates to speech as political technology. He knows the difference between truth and lies privately, but in politics, he doesn't really think that distinction matters. So I'm going to talk about the length of the street I live on, and I'm going to say what's politically strategic for me to say. Am I going to say it's 7 miles long or 7 yards long? I'm going to just make up the number that serves the best purpose, and there's nothing more to it. That is political speech, because speech in politics, when it comes to the difference between truth and lies, has to be thought of as a kind of political technology. Having said this, there are, of course, questions about Russia's capacity to sustain the war into the future, and economists and military experts debate how long they can go on. What I would say here is that Putin is absolutely open to the idea of revisiting the matter of stopping the war in the autumn. He was already open to stopping the war in recent months. It's funny when I say this because I actually agree with the analysis that Putin wasn't at all keen to end the war. What I want to say is that he was open to thinking about it if the deal Trump had offered him was judged by Putin to be sufficiently toxic for Ukraine, such that he feels, well, this is such a bad deal for Ukraine, it's actually worse for Ukraine than me continuing the war. And Putin, perhaps with an excessive expectation of his summer offensive, will be thinking that it's possible that he could be in a strong enough position come autumn to demand a degree of demilitarization in Ukraine that he couldn't get over the last few months. So certainly military spending could be reduced if Putin stops the war. Certainly Putin is hoping to stop the war at some point in the near future. But when I say hoping to stop the war, I don't mean hoping to stop escalation against the West or hoping to even stop war in general. Stopping the war in Ukraine is compatible with keeping on various kinds of hybrid escalations against the West. It's compatible with starting another war via some kind of low threshold provocation of Article 5 in the Baltics. And it's compatible with restarting the war in Ukraine, having stopped it. And so within that context, he will be open to it again. What I would also say is that if the war did stop, the militarization of the economy would, to a very large degree, continue. So that's enough on that remark for now. Let's read on what Putin says. Yes, we want to complete the special military operation with the results we need, certainly. And the best way to read that in this historical moment is in terms of results that forced Ukraine into a deal that is particularly toxic for it. But it's this that we take into account when planning our defense spending, not aggressive aspirations against Europe and the NATO countries. And we want to decrease spending while they want to increase it. So who is being aggressive here? And of course, it's true that the West is increasing spending now because it's planning aggressive action against Russia. And that's what we're about to see very shortly. I mean, we're about to see Estonia invade Russia and march on Moscow. So Russia is surrounded by imminent threats of aggression, and there barely is a West European or East European or Central European country that's not planning a march on Moscow that Putin needs to defend Russia from. So is Putin that delusional that, this sort of mock language I've just used, this frivolity I've just articulated, is stuff he actually takes seriously? Like, what's the threat that Russia experiences? Well, the threat that Russia experiences, as far as Putin's concerned, is primarily regime security threats. And Putin views the projection of US imperialism via NATO, in his understanding, into Eastern Europe as a threat to his domestic power. Well, that's really how he's thinking about aggression. Don't underestimate when Putin talks about aggression how much what he's saying is me. My throne is, under greater threat than I'm comfortable. So, what's going on with this? Is this guy okay? And should we be thinking that he is going potty? Well, I believe that what's happening here is that Putin is always on the cusp of not being convinced by his own bullshit, but yet in the end ending up convincing himself. So a great deal of what he talks about is a kind of enterprise to convince himself of his own narrative. And that's why there is this feeling of switching off monitors to planet Earth, this feeling of engaging others, inviting them to understand your grievances, while at the same time just talking to yourself and not even being tactically effective at getting others to see your grievances. So that neighbor, going on at you on your doorstep without actually wanting to communicate with you properly, they're talking to themselves and using you as a prop. So I think that there is a lot of that. I think that it's partly for that reason that Putin had so many false beliefs about how his operation, special military operation, would go. It's also the case, however, that there's this very interesting blend here of confidence and frustration. Putin is convinced that it's all going to go his way in the end, but it's frustrating that it's not happening yet, or it's not happening quickly enough, or it's not happening in the way he'd like. And he's almost saying, well, come on, history, you're just going there. Stop with the bloody detours. Stop giving me signs of life in European politics, right? Surely European powers, when it comes to foreign policy, are just on the road to being kind of useless rags. So why can't we just get shown that by history now? Why are there these detours and these weird cul-de-sacs? And I don't like any of this. And so you see now, he's not just talking to himself, he's just talking to history. He's addressing history, while being increasingly alone. So that's my take. Lots and lots of love.